and welcome to a special edition of the JCI's Conversations with Giants in Medicine. I'm Ushma Neal. Today we shift our format to celebrate the 100th birthday of the JCI and to recognize all of the men and women who have served as editor-in-chief of the JCI. Here are their stories.
Well, it was a fluke. Bill Majerus, who was one of our editors, who was the editor, was elected to be president of the ASCI. So he stepped down, and I was the closest person to him. We worked right next to each other. We had very good collegial interactions. So I volunteered to do it while he was doing presidency of ASCI. And it turned out it was a lot of fun, a lot of work, but a lot of fun.
I had a great time serving as a JCI associate and interim editor, primarily because the weekly meetings were actually fun, in comparison to the mostly grim, boring, or simply deadly nature of nearly all other administrative conclaves. Tom Stossel set the tone, which was informal and non-stuffy, but scientifically rigorous and entirely respectful of the manuscripts under review. The JCI then had a reputation for publishing high-quality, well-defended biochemical, physiological research that was, broadly speaking, clinically relevant. However, the JCI did not attract work that authors considered hot or really novel. Nevertheless, the discussion among the associate editors of the papers, the reviews, and the relevant field was lively and wide-ranging, and greatly amplified the interest and value of the meetings for the editors themselves.
I didn't apply, I didn't volunteer, I just got a phone call. I got a phone call, it was 1985, and the phone call happened to be from Dr. Joe Goldstein, who was then president of the ASCI. Later that year became a Nobel Prize winner. And he asked me if I was willing to serve as editor. And it was a difficult proposal to say no to. I have no idea what the selection process involved, perhaps a council of elders, followed by a puff of white smoke.
Actually, it was the most unexpected honor at a relatively early stage in my career. By tradition, the chief editorship changes hands every 5 years to a new institution. As I understand it, my selection as editor was the first time there was an advertised open national competition. Prior to that, I believe the selection was made by the proverbial old boys in the smoke-filled back room. Many institutions responded to letters of intent, but since the existing editorial office was at UCSF, no other UC schools were intending to apply. But the leaders at UCSD suggested that I should apply, just to make us look good. I initially demurred, but agreed that when I shared privately that I would not have any chance since I was a foreigner.
I contacted the chair of the Department of Medicine, who was then Steve Wasserman. And I said, I think we should put in for the JCI editorship. He said, what, do you want to do it? And I said, no, I don't particularly want to do it, but I know who should do it. And he said, who's that? And I said, Ajit Varki. He would be perfect for this. And so Ajit applied, and I'll let him, when you talk to him, tell his story, because he has an interesting story about how I think convinced them to let him do it. And so after he was picked, he said, well, you're the one that got me into this. And so I was one of the associate editors, along with several people from UCSD and from Scripps Research. I don't remember that we had anyone for sure from Salk, but I can't recall exactly. But at any rate, about 3 or 4 years in to the time we were doing this, he was asked to be the acting director of the Cancer Center. And he said, I can't do that. So since you're the one that got me into this, you have to serve as editor during the last year or so that we're going to have the JCI here. And he said, maybe to soften it, you should do it with somebody else so you guys can be co-editors and switch off and don't have to go in every day and
I got another call from the chairman's office, and I think this time it was Tachi Yamada was the chair of medicine. And someone said, have you rethought about entering the lottery to see if you could become the next JCI editor and bring it to Michigan? And I, very quickly I said, no, I thought about this before, but I think this is going to be so disruptive to my academic career that this is probably not the best choice for me. And there was a pause. And then they said, it was one of his representatives, there was a pause. They said, no, you don't understand, Steve. Dr. Yamada is not asking you if you're interested in doing this. He is telling you, you have to do it. So I thought, oh, great.
I can't really remember exactly what drove me to do this, but as you know, there was a family connection. My dad had been the JCI editor, so I was very familiar with the journal. And I felt like it was a good time to bring it back to Columbia. And I think most exciting to me was the idea of working closely with a really great group of colleagues, getting to know them better and sharing science with them. So I think those were the motivating factors. Of course, I had no idea what I was getting myself into.
I think I remember that the call for editorships came out ridiculously early, probably the summer or the fall of 2005, about a year and a half before you started. At that point, I had been at Penn for 11 years, so I knew people pretty well and I was fairly well connected. And I had also been the renal division chief for 7 years. And as you know, Ushma, knowing me, I don't like to do things for too long. And so having been the renal division chief for 7 years, I was already thinking, what am I going to do next? And what's next on the horizon for me? So I saw that let's call it the advertisement. And I thought this could really be a lot of fun. And we had great colleagues at Penn. And I thought I would really enjoy, if I got the job, being editor-in-chief and could put a really strong team together. So I applied.
It was very straightforward. A number of my colleagues noticed the request for application, and we got together and they encouraged the application from Duke. And they thought at the time that I would be a strong candidate. We could put together a very strong board. And that's what we did. We got a number of individuals to brainstorm about what the editorial board would look like, and got them together. And almost everyone that we approached was really excited to do it.
Hopkins was really quite keen on hosting the JCI. We'd never hosted it before, and I was asked by then Dean Paul Rothman to assemble a team and put together an application. It was a bit of an internal competition, but ultimately I was selected. I must say, I was a little bit reluctant. My area of research wasn't one that was highly featured in the JCI. In fact, at the time, I think I had published one paper in the JCI, although submitted a number more. And moreover, of the prior 4 editors, 3 of them were researchers in cardiovascular disease. So I thought this wasn't really going to work out, but it did. And once selected, I was really focused on making sure that the members of our team, who are already busy, would be committed to the work and we could keep them motivated.
Yeah, so it's just happenstance, I'll say. So I spent many years at Penn, as you know, 16 years in all. And 2016 came to Hopkins to lead the endocrine division and serve as a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor. So in 2017, Gordon Tomaselli, whom I knew because through other people, because he's an alumnus of Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and I did my residency there and so on. So we got to know each other. And he was the chief of cardiology at that time. Became the editor-in-chief and asked me to serve as his deputy editor, together with Arturo Casadevall, who happens to have taught at Einstein, by the way. So we kind of knew ourselves. So I accepted, and things went well for a year, and somehow a year later, Gordon decided to step down and move to Einstein. And so that was a mini crisis, sort of, because none of us had kind of planned for this. But after some thought, I decided to step up, and we had to go through, and believe it or not, an interview process with the ASCI board and so on. So that's in short, that's how things played out.
I had a longstanding interest in the JCI. I was a former president of the American Society for Clinical Investigation, and as a longtime author in the JCI, I have always sent what I think is our best work to the JCI. So it is a journal that has meant a lot to me because it's where I like to publish things. It's where I like to read things. And so I became very familiar with the journal many years ago when I had been president of the society. And so when I was thinking about things I might like to do, which actually goes back to probably 2014. And I was at the time moving from the University of Chicago to Northwestern. And it was one of the things I actually pitched to the dean at the time, saying, if I come, this is something I really want to do, and I hope I have your support to do it. And of course, he was very enthusiastic about it.
It's amazing how it's changed. Each subspecialty had its own journal. Like I'm a hematologist, and there was the journal of blood, and there was another journal on thrombosis, and the same held for all the other subspecialties. But the JCI had the reputation of being above all those, and was competitive at that time, I think, even with Science and Nature, which were considered the top general journals, and then Cell. So those three. And that's how we looked at it, that we were competing in these top journals. And there were just very fewer options for authors.
Well, it was a very prestigious journal and well thought of. It was, of course, a much different era. Open access was just being contemplated. We didn't have today's myriad of journals. Nobody was thinking about AI, but the tectonic plates of publishing were starting to move, and we could feel them moving pretty quickly. We were about a decade into the new era of molecular genetics and medicine. Genentech and Chiron, the two barrier biotechs, had been founded, raised visibility, and the competition was becoming increasingly fierce and crowded for that new work.
I mean, at that time, the JCI was the king, certainly in terms of clinical research, translational research. I often tell people, if you look at Nature back then, they virtually never published something about a human being. It was all very basic. And science was pretty much the same way. There is very little. Now, of course, that's very different. In fact, if I may be mistaken, but it was during the time the journal started that Nature started Nature Medicine. And they were sort of a major challenge for the JCI during that period. There was like, oh, how are we going to keep the JCI being what we want it to be?
It was still scary. I'm sure it's much scarier now. But at the time, we're going, oh no, there are these journals called Cell, Science, and Nature that were increasingly publishing works in the biomedical arena, that they also knew that there's a lot of interest in this particular area. And at the same time, Nature had launched already Nature Medicine and Nature Genetics. So we already thought, oh Lord, there's already almost too much competition. So we kind of thought about what are we going to have to do here that's actually within our control. So the first thing we thought about is, we'd like to increase the profile and visibility of the journal.
JCI was one of the first journals to really venture into open access and to champion that. And I think that was the biggest change that occurred around that time in scientific publishing. Was obviously very important.
What I remember in 2007 was that open access was hotly debated. We were open access, but people had to pay to help support the journal. And that was a model that was, people were talking about all the time from the standpoint of making the JCI budget. Impact factor was a huge issue, and we were getting, I think, top tier papers, but I was never under the illusion that people, that we were always everyone's first choice journal, but we were many people's first choice journal. And I was always very proud of what we published, but impact factor was the key. There was a lot of discussion about raising impact factor by publishing fewer papers and more reviews. And that always engendered a lot of discussion among the editorial board is what's the purpose of the journal? Is it to have a high impact factor, or is it to publish as many good science papers as we can?
It was an interesting time. We started our tenure in 2012. And, it was my opinion at the time that many editors of journals, of some journals, felt that it was their job to operate as gatekeepers, as if the science and the scientific process needed protection from bad actors. It was a time where issues of reproducibility had surfaced. There was also the rise of the sleuths scouring the literature for potential malfeasance. So it was an interesting time. But as editor, I had a different view. I set out a culture on the board where we'd publish science that was rigorous and advanced knowledge, but we aimed to limit excessive experimentation.
Yeah, so like today, it's a field that's just remarkably changing. And in 2017, when we took over, I think the history of the ASCI journals is really reflective of what was going on in the publishing space. A year before we started, Howard Rockman, who was then the editor of the JCI, started JCI Insight. And he wound up, manning that with a team from Duke for about 3.5 years, well into our term, before he turned it over to Kathy Collins at the University of Michigan. So the biomedical landscape was continuing to evolve. There weren't as many so-called daughter journals as there are now, but they were increasing in number. Seemed like every week there was a new Nature or Science or Circulation or some other daughter journal that was popping up. And open access was becoming more and more of the way things were going in publishing.
The big issue was on the commercial side. The for-profit journals were proliferating all over the place and becoming super specialized, which made them more attractive to some extent for authors, despite the huge charges.
I think it served as, or it serves still, as an example of high quality, carefully done biomedical research, asking problems, studying problems related to human disease and physiology. That was how we felt about it back in 1981. I don't think that's really changed.
I think the impact has been huge. The JCI from the start has sort of focused on translational science, work into space, ranging from discovery to early demonstration of benefit in humans. It's raised the visibility of that whole era. And of course, that plays to the strength of physician scientists, which is what the ASCI is all about.
Focus of JCI has been on being a bridge between basic science and medicine, presenting fundamental discoveries that are later translated to practice and then published in other venues.
Oh, I think it over the years has been just a really important journal. Certainly, my initial efforts scientifically had to do with metabolism, diabetes, and the development of the glucose clamp, which was still around today. And we were with the people that started that. And they're classic papers that have been in the JCI for years. And I think that's exactly where people wanted to publish.
I still think that at the end of the day, for anyone interested in biomedical research, whether they're a basic scientist, a physician scientist, whatever, I still think this is one of the go-to journals for this area, that if you really want something that's novel, balanced with rigor, true rigor, this is the place to go publish.
Well, I think what stands out with the JCI, as you know, is that it's a journal edited by scientists for scientists. And I think has a great brand name for, many, many generations of scientists, not only physician scientists, but basic science as well. And I was thinking about it when you asked me to do this interview, that it's remarkable. One of the great strengths of JCI is that it changes editorial boards every 5 years. So you get a new look, a fresh look, but it doesn't really change the journal fundamentally. It has been for 100 years a leading biomedical research journal. And even though new ideas come in and new people come in, when you think about it, it's been very stable. It's had a great tradition to it, and I think that bodes well for the next 100 years.
I think the category of clinical medicine best exemplifies the JCI, in my opinion. And clinical medicine is a category where we publish human research. In some regard, I feel this is the most exciting.
I've always viewed the JCI as a forum for biomedical research with broad appeal and very clear links to clinical medicine and disease. Work that would interest and should be read by not only content experts, but those in biomedical research that are not content experts, those who had expertise outside the field of interest of the specific paper.
So my answer here will obviously be colored or biased. And the reason is, I think when it comes to clinical investigation, I think the JCI is the gold standard. I can't think of any other journal that comes close.
The JCI, through its editorial board, holds a very unique position in that it really is covering mechanisms of human disease. And, I come at it from a geneticist perspective where we can learn so much about mechanism by understanding genetic mechanisms underlying a disease process. But that's a very interesting position to be trying to define genetic mechanisms of disease, and particularly doing it from the viewpoint of the American Society of Clinical Investigation, which is physician scientists. And so I think there isn't another journal run by so many physician scientists who, by nature of their training, bring a sort of different viewpoint to things. We obviously have lots of PhD members of our board and many PhD authors, and we value that as well. But I like what our editorial board can bring to looking at papers and how they think about things. So is this a cool mechanism? And does it really mean something for human disease? There are very few journals that can answer that question the way we do.
Well, it was a long time ago. So what I remember really is the camaraderie, that we all realized we were in for a lot of work, but we were happy to do it. And we felt it was a big learning process for ourselves. I mean, when you handle 3 or 4 papers a week and have to read all them and come to conclusions, you really broaden your knowledge. So we all felt that we learned a lot about medicine and how to do research and various techniques, which we would not have gotten without being on this board.
And we had some staff perfectly tailored to that job. There was a young Irish woman with a charming lilt in her voice. She was the one who called to solicit the reviews. No one could say no to her. Everybody said, sure, I'll review that paper. But when it was time to get the review back and we didn't have it, we had another guy in the office, actually a charming fellow, really warm heart, but he'd been an ex-Israeli military pilot. And he could be pretty fearsome on the phone. And those reviewers listened and they responded. So as a result, we got fewer excuses for late reviews, but some were really doozies. And they were so good that I actually read them aloud at the annual meeting when I was giving my report. I went to the notes and found a few. I took the manuscript to a meeting in Europe and I couldn't find a typewriter. I lost the manuscript on the New York State Thruway. I lost the manuscript in the men's room. I lost the manuscript in the Pleistocene layer on my desk. And some of the rejections were so funny and piercing that I also read them aloud.
But my favorite memory is that of introducing the JCI Free Online in the early days of the internet. Prior editors such as Phil Majerus and Bruce Scharschnitz had put away invested funds in a rainy day account. I continued this account and luckily got out of the market just before the great .com crash. This fund now approached enough that I could go to the society and let us release the JCI on the web. That's freely access to everyone. I didn't realize that we'd actually created something which would later many years be called open access. People have forgotten that JCI did it first.
We developed a shorthand which was, we had the words NFU, not for us. And we would immediately be able to reject out of hand at certain papers NFU. And the third thing I'll just remember, but I have to be a little careful because this is a little bit crude. There was a story that maybe you've already heard this story, but Phil Majerus, who had been at WashU, the editor, and was quite a strong individual. And we heard the story. He told me the story. I visited WashU, and he told me the story that he had handled a paper had been handled, and there had been a split decision. And so he secretly became reviewer 3 and criticized the paper considerably. And so the authors came back with a paper in which they said they could address the concerns of reviewer 1 and reviewer 2, but reviewer 3 was basically an idiot and didn't know what he was talking about. And so he responded, he wrote back to them, F you, basically, in those words. So we used to talk about the Majerus response. That became the Majerus response that we would sometimes want to say in our meetings. We never said that to any author, any of us, but it was sort of a wonderful thing.
Since I'm an argumentative sort, this was great fun for me for 5 years and an entire board. And I have to say this, that, most times people say, oh, you must have been so relieved when your tenure was finally up. But I have to tell you, a majority, almost everybody in the board came forward and said, I would do it for another 5 years if I could. Just the discussing science, hearing different perspectives, it's not your own work.
Most importantly was the great interactions with the editorial board, meeting every Tuesday, late afternoon, learning from my colleagues. It was a fantastic 5-year run, created some really good, long-lasting colleague friendships through that experience. And looking back on it, it was an enormous amount of work, but I probably would do it all over again. The biggest impact for me personally was probably my famous Big Lebowski editorial. And when I look back on that, I think that it did serve a purpose by energizing thought around how we can make the NIH more responsive to the needs of the scientific community, which was my goal in writing that.
I do remember a couple of specific comments that came with reviews. I think the one that I remember best was when some irate author wrote back when a paper had been rejected and said something, and I'm going to quote as well as I can here now, said that if I sent in a paper that I had a dog that talked, you would come back and say, yes, but what's the mechanism? So that was probably my favorite. I do remember a faux pas that I committed that, Ushma, you will remember too, no names here, where I accidentally CC'd somebody on an email where I was complaining that I was getting sick and tired of their whining and they should get a life.
COVID was a challenge, Ushma, as you know. 2020 was a pivotal year, and we had to figure out how to carry on with our business. So we actually wrote an editorial with other editors highlighting the things we did differently. So we were able to move from our roundtable meetings, our weekly meetings, to a video format, right? Which worked very well. The other key thing is that many members of our editorial group were ID specialists or public health specialists who had other things to do. And I'm glad that other editors in our group, associated, were able to step up and pick up the pieces and help. Because our submission rate increased about 66% during that time, right? And so I did a recent math. From the time we started to when we left in 2022, we handled more than 23,000 manuscripts, out of which maybe 1,600 went into publication, but the work had to be done, right? And so I was glad that, very grateful that our associate editors were able to get the job done. My other favorite memory has to do with Greg Semenza being awarded a Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2019. think it's ever happened for most journals to have a senior member receive such an award. And I remember very well, so the announcement came on, was it October 7th, 2019? And we were kind of cheering during our meeting the following day. So the announcement was on a Monday. We had our weekly meeting on a Tuesday, and we all shared ideas and so on. Greg couldn't show up because he had to deal with the press. But interestingly, the following week, he came for the editorial board meeting. It shows you how dedicated he was to the journal. And we had a little reception for him and went on right to our business of reviewing the papers and so on.
And I'll mention because right now we're in the midst of the Paris Olympics. This one was a real head spinner and not for scientific reasons. The paper was from a group in Paris. It reported some human research. It was really groundbreaking. We loved it. We accepted it. It was on its way to publication when we got a letter also from Paris implying that the work had been fabricated. Well, that was worrisome. So we paused publication. I contacted INSERM and asked them to look into things. And INSERM got back to us with a remarkable story. It turned out that the manuscript was the innocent bystander of a love triangle. And the letter claiming fraud was from the jilted paramour of one of the authors. INSERM said the work was fine to publish, so we did.
So my top choice would be the papers by Mike Brown and Joe Goldstein, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1985. So they're long-term ASCI members and they're ardent supporters of the JCI and the ASCI. I particularly remember a 1993 paper they published while I was editor on hypercholesteremia in low density LDL receptor knockout mice and its reversal by adenovirus mediated gene delivery. This followed another 1994 in JCA, the massive xanthomatosis and atherosclerosis induced by cholesterol treating in these mice. I noticed that Mike and Joe recently wrote a very nice article in JCA about the importance of JCA and the whole field of lipid metabolism and disease.
My primary appointment now has been for some years in pharmacology. And this was a paper about grapefruit juice and its impact on drug absorption and degradation. And I asked a well-known guy who subsequently spent a major position at the FDA to write a review about this. And I went back and reread it because I remembered what he said. And he was very insightful in saying that, that yes, there's no question that grapefruit can have an effect, especially on certain of the CYP, CYP3A, the metabolic enzyme, but he said, but the amount of grapefruit juice that you'd have to drink, some of the studies you'd have to do 8 ounces 2 or 3 times a day. And in fact, that had been used in the paper that was published. So his comment was, I don't think it's really that much of a risk for most patients. But this is very interesting sort of pharmacology, biology.
I also looked at interesting papers that came out during our tenure. And I think one of the most highly cited with about 5,000 citations is a paper from Tony Ferranti and Rudy Leibel, a very interesting paper. It showed the role of macrophages and inflammation in adipose tissue. If you scroll back to 1955 with a paper by Halville, Howie Eder, and Bragdon, which was the most cited paper in the history of JCI, also having to do with lipoproteins and how to separate them. So there's a connection there. And then fast forward 20 years now with the GLP-1 agonists, and I think there's a connection there between the inflammation in the adipose tissue and what Tony and Rudy reported 20 years ago in, I think, probably the most cited paper during our 5-year tenure.
I mean, not surprisingly, it's going to be COVID related, right? And so at the time the epidemic was really at the peak, I'm talking March, April 2020, thereabout. We had a paper from a group of scientists from China describing, so the first author was Chen, So it's Chen et al. In 2020, basically describing the clinical and immunological features of this new syndrome, of this new syndrome, right? And as you can imagine, it's not typical JCI, because at that point, sure, there was an association with COVID, that was a given, but they couldn't really offer quote unquote mechanistic insights, right? So I remember we had a very heated discussion. We said, well, other journals are publishing this type of work. I don't think we're out to copy anybody, but this particular group had some pieces in place, especially the immunology, which competitors did not have, right? So after a lot of discussion and debate, we decided, so my favorite term, anytime we'd meet, we'd say, guys, let's give them a chance, right? So we decided to give them a chance and say, look, they're describing a new clinical syndrome. It's evolving. This is at the heart of where it started in China, right? And they had some immunology in place. So I wouldn't say we bent the rules, but we were forward-looking enough to say, look, let's give them a chance, let them put it together. And then we had an editorial piece to go with that. So that was one of my favorite papers, actually. It turned out to be one of the defining papers in the field. It's very much referenced. I think they are up to close to 3,000 citations since 2020.